Any film that undergoes the mere touch of Lars von Trier is destined to emerge with some preconceived notions. But as is to be expected from any artist whose work deals in provocation, upon your art becoming shrouded within controversial subject matter, one must anticipate public scrutiny more frequently than your less offensive contemporaries. And although in this instance it means the reception of the artist's work is incredibly divisive, it also happens to be the crux of his charm.
I didn't like it, and I feel angry because I feel manipulated. And the only person I can express it to is you. I feel manipulated by you. How do you feel about that?
I feel wonderful.
Often described as a manipulator and facetious, primarily by himself, having experienced the work of von Trier firsthand, I'm inclined to believe otherwise. The classification of his filmography is a daunting task. His plots are rarely succinct, his attitude to cinema is questionable at best, but to me, the finest filmmakers are those that raise questions. Questions not only about the boundaries of art, but how in breaching those boundaries we paradoxically broaden the capabilities of cinema. With a form almost unmatched in its diversity, von Trier's avant-garde approach makes him one of the finest examples of the modern day auteur. But how do you define someone that's determined to resist artistic categorization?
I would leave the cinema just after the next to last song, and the film would just go on forever.
Von Trier's claim on his craft was that in order to create original art, filmmakers should distinguish themselves from one another stylistically. This philosophy truly came to fruition when a collaboration with fellow Danish filmmaker Thomas Vinterberg established the 1995 Dogma movement. A set of rules known as the vow of chastity would become essential in the development of von Trier's filmic attitude. Although only truly conforming to the Dogma rules with his film The Idiots, the creation of this edict would become the principal foundation for how von Trier's position as a filmmaker would be recognised. His artistry can be summed up in one word: restriction.
If you have some limitations when you work, like these rules or like other things, then you are forced kind of to use your imagination. You have this idea of being an artist as being completely free. And that is what the whole idea of Dogma is arguing.
Some artists share the viewpoint that to gain the most from any medium, as much of its vocabulary should be utilised as possible. However, von Trier's school of thought is almost a contradictory philosophy. Perhaps by eliminating some of the most rudimentary techniques of the medium, can artists reach a different kind of freedom. As we see in his experimental documentary The Five Obstructions, creative amendments to the form have to be made when you're stripped of a standard procedure.
Intet klipper over topfredags. Det vil være destruktivt. Det er totalt destruktivt. Hvad fanden vil han skal stille op med det? Det er som om han smadrer det fra starten.
For von Trier, almost every project is an exercise in style. We go from verite-like handheld to stunningly detailed black and white shooting. Aspect ratio changes and colours saturate, sometimes all in a single scene. But the reason that von Trier's extensive visual style is implemented and why it's permissible is because these techniques supplement that which is missing from a von Trier film. For example, Melancholia is an end-of-the-world film that gives away its ending in the first few moments. How do you then make a film where the characters' fates are immediately revealed? Dogville is a period piece with almost all of its art direction removed. If you take out any mandatory component in art, you have to improvise and experiment with new storytelling techniques to say what you want to say. Much like The Five Obstructions, this is the heart of von Trier's filmmaking, challenging himself and in turn the art form.
I min egen filmiske opdragelse, der har netop det, som Jørgen jo så smukt kalder spillereglerne, altid været meget, meget vigtige. Det er noget, som han har indført i mit univers. Og disse spilleregler er altså nogle begrænsninger eller en selvtugt, om du vil.
Von Trier's status as a revisionist to film form isn't unjustified. Whether it's adopting atypical chapter-based structures or peculiar fusions of genre hybrids, von Trier's work is heavily rooted in a deconstruction of the anatomy of cinema, to break down what we know about the fundamentals of filmmaking and rebuild as if those rules never existed. In von Trier's work, not only does he search for answers to his characters' plights, perhaps more importantly, he searches for solutions to the enigma of cinema itself. By refusing to conform to its conventions, whether due to contempt or experimentation, the typical outcome is something that highlights the very unreality of cinema. Where most strives for verisimilitude, von Trier too finds ways to replicate real life, but then something like this will happen. His output is rich with these trademarks that serve to shatter the cinematic illusion. Why? Von Trier has a fondness for dramatic gestures, not simply referring to his off-screen antics, but what I think his films excel in is the seldom mentioned predominance of human drama, because beyond his proclivity to repel the audience through extremities, characters and story matter most to von Trier. His films are, more than anything, a journey to the nature of the human heart, what people will do for their lovers, for their children, for their safety. There's much sincerity that goes unmentioned in his work. However, what differentiates a von Trier film from other dramas is that he takes very human concepts and escalates them to almost metaphysical levels. As if there's some cosmic relation of the human condition, he explores his themes and seeks to find patterns across our reality, hoping that there's some equation that pieces all of it together.
So it's 0 plus 1 makes 1, and 1 plus 1 makes 2, and 2 plus 1 makes 3, and 3 plus 2 makes 5, and 5 plus 3 makes 8.
To divulge in ideas in such an extravagant manner, it makes sense that they be delivered through a self-awareness of the medium's limitations. Von Trier attempts eclectic techniques that create the reality of his worlds, but due to the very nature of cinema, we can only believe so much, so maybe in that case, it's better to acknowledge its artifice.
Manipulation is also something you do to yourself when you go into a cinema. Either you leave the cinema straight away, or you have to get some kind of relationship what is happening and imagine that these people are real people, you know.
This bulldozing of audience immersion is the artist easing us into a mutual realisation of his themes. By dismantling the barrier of the film world and our own, it in turn breaks the shackles of the story only existing in the space of the character. It becomes more than just their story, it becomes our own.
The earth is evil. We don't need to grieve for it.
These are themes so broad that they do require large digressions in the plot to explore them. In doing so, Von Trier films become split into a side regarding humanity and a side regarding symbolism. The two complement one another, but they're simultaneously very separate. This separation in turn has an effect on the visual style of Von Trier. Throughout his work, he never finds drama through the cinematic image. Where other artists will use compositional techniques to evoke moods and meanings, the physical image is almost negligible to Von Trier when evoking emotion. A technique inherited from the Dogma movement was to make performance and story paramount.
Okay, som alle argumenter, jo, men det forstår jeg godt, argumenterne kan være nok så gode, men det nytter ikke, når du sætter argumenter op mod følelserne. Og det andet er en teori, og når du sætter det op, så taber teorien altid.
This emphasis of emotion over theory is most evident in Von Trier's use of editing. At first glance, it's a far more frantic style than archetypal cutting. Typically, the key for most editors is to let shots run long enough so emotion has time to settle. However, Von Trier's approach is to cut out the how and simply leave us with the what. Leave out how we got to where we are, and just show us the product of what went unseen. The story becomes elliptical and chronologically disjointed, but the result is a honing on the scene's emotional intensity.
The main rule we had in the editing was we should cut emotionally. That we shouldn't respect the transportation or the formality or the establishing of the situation. We should go late into the situation as late as we dared and leave it as soon as the emotion had peaked.
The shots may be short, but the sequences are long, and the culmination is a collection of moments that capture the absolute peaks of emotion that occurred within a single space. But when structure doesn't expose the drama of his work, acting does. The thing about directors is that perhaps their most important job is the one the audience doesn't see. How do they direct their actors?
You walk into a room and you start shooting, but if you've got a 10-page dialogue scene and he hasn't told you what the camera can do or what you can do, or whether you should be naked or not naked, or whether you can take a glass of water, you basically make the scene on your feet and then he reacts to it.
Von Trier gives actors free rein to improvise. Reminiscent of the techniques of the Nouvelle Vague, his screenplays are seen as mere blueprints. The plot is all there, but those idiosyncrasies of the actors that can't be envisioned, they have to be found organically.
Jeg synes, det er så sjovt at få lov til at dække lidt ned.
It allows creativity to take centre stage, and it further shows that Von Trier doesn't treat his personal dramas as secondary facets. If anything, he wants the emotion shown to be as real as possible.
It's just too much for me. I thought I was strong, I just can't take it, guys.
Although the much easier to dissect portion, these human segments are still rife with symbolism, not necessarily in the filmic image, but in content. For example, in Antichrist, we see themes discussing the innate evil of nature, the dangers of femininity. It's symbolically overwrought in story and action, but not in image composition. Yet as the themes of his stories grow larger in scale, then does image become a priority. Von Trier is a handheld director when it comes to drama. It captures the free-flowing nature of the human spirit. Yet what separates his exploration of symbolism stylistically is the static camera. In these instances, the static shot has more in common with the painted image as opposed to the cinematic one. The obvious distinction between the two styles insinuates that these images should be looked at with a different attitude. Yet the entirety of Von Trier's symbolic portions are to be viewed through a sharper analytical lens, the same way one would read a painting. But it's in these portions that the concept of a narration ceases to be truthful, and two harmonizing realities are created. These are the worlds of Von Trier. Like light and dark, the two separations of his story are just different sides of the same coin. Whenever his films seem to enter a territory that feels unfamiliar, it's because we're seeing the same story just within the ever-changing perspective of film. Von Trier doesn't settle on one manner of cinematic storytelling, because he knows that film form is infinitely malleable. The plot continues, it just begins to be told through allegorical means, and if the artist is searching for truth within his medium, it only makes sense that he explores the multiple structures and possibilities of how his story can be told. Although things may seem to stop for an unnecessary deviation, it's simply von Trier's way of demonstrating complete freedom from cinematic norms. This division of von Trier's films demands different approaches in order to comprehend it. However, for his philosophy to fully make sense, it requires the realisation that both segments are necessary for one another, because together, they tell one story. Jim Morrison once said that the appeal of cinema lies in the fear of death, suggesting that the reason we're so drawn towards the form is the acknowledgement of our own mortality and the sense of satisfaction we gain from watching what could have been. But I think this quote goes hand in hand with the filmmaking of von Trier. There are those that regard his work as pessimistic because of its grim subject matter. However, it's not as though von Trier goes out of his way to make shocking films. He goes out of his way to make honest films.
When I look around and look at works of art that I like, they all contain melancholia to some point. I would describe it as being the salt you put in the food. You know, if you forgot to put melancholia in, then you have to have some melancholia at the table to put it in to make it become a real dish.
For me, to understand Lars von Trier is to accept that art is never meant to be completely understood, but we should rejoice in that. There are infinite possibilities yet to be touched upon, and filmmakers like Lars von Trier have the tenacity to explore where others deem dangerous. Existing purely through unorthodox methods, von Trier shows us that art has no limitations, and to break its boundaries is what it means to be a true artist.